Hello, pattern readers. Are you ready for another Wheel of Time episode deep dive? In this video, I will break down episode 102, Shadows Waiting. First, I will give you my book spoiler-free reactions and explanations for what is happening in this episode, then ending with some deep dives into book-to-screen changes. Like the last episode, this one starts with a prologue, which is related but not in a straight line to the main action of the episode. And this one is shorter and more focused. In a camp of the Children of the Light, more commonly called White Cloaks, we meet Eamon Valda, a man who clearly embraces brutality in all of his actions. It's a thoroughly chilling to the point of being unhinged portrayal. With this introduction, we see that the White Cloaks are an antagonist of the Aes Sedai and a frighteningly effective one. To have the ability to disable an Aes Sedai and then remove her hands, to then tie her up to burn at the stake, well, watching with relish, all makes these characters a legitimate threat, and Valda in particular is skin-crawling. We then get an absolutely gorgeous and haunting title sequence. This was nothing that I had anticipated. I had really been hoping for a banger of a credit sequence, and this did deliver. The loom and weaving animation is gorgeous. The music is haunting. It manages to have a timeless rather than ancient feel to it. Didn't remind me in the slightest of Game of Thrones, but was memorable in its own way. I'm so curious if they will choose different images to animate in this way in future seasons. We cut back to our main group, fleeing the two rivers on horseback, and the Trollocs are right behind them. It's not long at all before they do reach Tarn Ferry, and Moiraine declines to take them behind the walls, saying nothing but deep water will deter the shadow spawn. She demands passage across river immediately from the old ferryman, Master Hightower, and offers generous compensation along with it. So there's a touch of wry humor in his, "You're not the type of woman who hears no often," and Moraine's self-aware response, "I am not." But the humor in the scene ends there. The entire exchange with the ferryman, while shadow spawn amass on the shore they've left behind, was surprisingly effective. Moiraine wants Hightower to follow them to the next town, but he is intent on crossing back to the other shore to find his son, despite the shrieking Fade and horde of Trollocs. Lan and Moiraine do not hesitate to sink the ferry to prevent him from crossing back and giving the shadow spawn a way to follow them. And then he calls her a monster and foolishly throws himself in the whirlpool and drowns. Egwene is distraught at being unable to stop or help him. Rand says nothing but glares grimly at Lan, who returns the gaze. Moiraine has a split-second downcast look but is not deterred, hurrying them on to try to lose the shadow spawn before they can cross another way. Once the group is able to stop and camp for a brief rest, we have a little scene between the four ta'veren, and the writing here is really well done because it's able to, in only a few lines, get us into the mindset of each of these characters. Matt is trying to lighten everyone's spirits with one-liners, and by keeping a lightly mocking, easy attitude. Perrin is lost in grief, but does try to offer Egwene a word of comfort, such as he can, about Nynaeve. Rand is trying to rally the group to a plan out of his distrust of Moiraine. Egwene, though heartbroken about Nynaeve, still manages to counter Rand's points with some good observations of her own. The Trollocs did follow them, just as Moiraine said, and what if she's right about one of them being the dragon? Rand seems to have trouble sleeping after Moiraine interrupts them and tells them to go to sleep. He is aware when Moiraine wakes Egwene and pulls her to the side. I admire the writing in this Egwene and Moiraine scene as well. Egwene accuses Moiraine of killing the ferryman, and Moiraine uses the opportunity to explain the 3 oaths that bind her. She cannot speak a word that is not true. She cannot use the power as a weapon except to defend her life or Lan's or another sister's. She cannot use the power to make a weapon. She says outright that she did not kill the ferryman. He wasted his own life. And she makes Egwene think through what would have happened if Moiraine had allowed him to cross back. He would have died at the hands of the Trollocs, and then they would have been able to follow them. It's exposition, but in a really elegant and effective way. And this continues as Moiraine transitions to telling Egwene that she has the ability to channel the One Power, just as Moiraine does. She guides Egwene through her first touch of the power, using a jewel that she carries, in a scene drawn directly from the book. Egwene, true to her character, never hesitates to try and immediately wants to learn. Egwene lies next to a sleeping Rand, and he wakes. They're both apologetic, but Rand rebuffs this overture of hers, saying he wants to be alone. Egwene walks away. Perrin is brooding by a fire and inspecting a leg wound he has told no one about. I am curious what will come of this. Is he not telling anyone because he doesn't want to be healed by Moiraine? Does he not want to bother her because he knows that she is exhausted and injured herself? Is he just too depressed to care? He is thinking of Layla when Egwene approaches and interrupts his thought. He gives her his coat and asks if she thinks they will ever go home. She doesn't have to think long. No. Back to Rand, we have a scene that is perfectly disturbing. We think that he's awake. He sits up coughing and gagging as he pulls a bat out of his mouth. And then he sees a dark figure with glowing eyes before he really startles awake the next morning to find there really is a dead bat on the ground. In fact, they're everywhere. And we learn that the others had similar dreams of bats and a man with eyes like embers. Rand, once again, is the one to confront Moiraine and accuse her of putting these images in their dreams. Lan stands implacably between Moiraine and Rand. Moiraine tells them to tell her immediately if they have any of these dreams again, or if anyone tries to talk to them in their dreams, which have more power than they know. Rand wants answers, while Moiraine wants to leave immediately. Rand is furious and shouts no at Moiraine, something few people would dare to do. He demands to know where they are headed and what will happen to men in the White Tower, even throwing a cheap shot at Lan, calling him an errand boy. Moiraine calls his bluff, riding on immediately and telling him to go where he will. Rand then turns his anger on Egwene, who is packing to follow Moiraine. We are really starting to see the divisions here. Rand is angry with Egwene for putting more trust in Moiraine than in him. Egwene fires back that Moiraine has helped them and kept them going with the power at the expense of herself while she gets weaker. She doesn't blame Moiraine for leaving him behind. And then Rand says what will hurt them both the most, that Egwene has already left him behind as well. It is Mat who saves the day, telling Rand not to be an ass and that all they have is each other. That Rand is right about Moiraine keeping them alive for her own reasons, but ending with a joke again, better stay on the good side of a woman who shoots fireballs. And he moves to follow Moiraine, asking Rand if he's coming, which he does. On the one hand, I understand Rand's anger here. Their lives have been upended, and Moiraine is not forthcoming with explanations. I don't blame Rand for wanting answers. On the other hand, he is being stubborn to the point of blindness here in refusing to acknowledge what Egwene is pointing out in Moiraine's favor. And then he turns his anger on Egwene over something that is unfair. She made a decision that she had every right to make and that he had previously offered her understanding for. Now, I can't really blame him for expressing these uglier feelings given the trauma that they've all been through, and everyone processes that differently, but Egwene does not deserve to be on the receiving end of it. I do really love how Mat handles it in this scene. It's still a surprise to me how much I love this character already, given that it took me until book 3 to love him. But I am really glad to see these sides of Mat's character sooner in the show. I like this little detail of Lan hanging back to make sure they were following, but they're not on their move long again before Lan comes back from scouting to report a group of white cloaks ahead. The tension of the scene with Jeffrey Bornhald and Eamon Valda is palpable. Moiraine has to speak very carefully here, as she later explains to Egwene. She can, for instance, say yes when they ask her if she came from the Borderlands. She can only misdirect so far as to say that the village they came from was called Tarn Ferry. She also has no choice but to let them know that her wound came from a Trolloc when asked about it. If one of them had asked her outright, is she an Aes Sedai, she could have said, I am no witch. But if they had pressed her for a yes or no, she could not have said no. I don't think we can infer from this that the White Cloaks are incompetent, but drawing upon book knowledge, I will say that I do believe the White Cloaks do not believe the 3 oaths are real. The other thing emphasized in this scene is the difference between the usual military arm of the children and the Questioners, which are a breed of their own. Eamon Valda is a questioner, and we can see the contrast in his handling of Moiraine with Jeffrey Bornhald's more respectful tone. Valda begins touching Moiraine without any need. It seems mainly to let her know her powerlessness in the situation. I thoroughly loved Lan's response to this, that men in the Borderlands who don't keep their hands to themselves might lose them. A casual warning that he will only tolerate Valda's grotesque behavior so far. We can also gather that in comparison to Valda, Bornhald seems much less rabidly against Aes Sedai. He even goes so far as to suggest that Moiraine's wound will not heal unless she finds an Aes Sedai in Whitebridge. From there, we see the Questioners are heading south, presumably towards Loghain and the Aes Sedai, while the military faction under Bornhald means to find the Trollocs. By the way, the musical theme for the White Cloaks is so good to end this scene. As Egwene questions Moiraine further about the oaths, Moiraine reveals that she cannot heal her own wound. And she tells Egwene what a lot of people say about Aes Sedai, that the truth they say is not always the truth you think you hear. She smiles as she tells Egwene to listen carefully. In the travel montage that follows, I love this shot of a ruined bridge where there is no longer a river. another remnant of the breaking, it would seem. What follows is a beautiful scene, which begins when Matt notices his downcast friend and starts to sing a song, Weep for Manetheren, which they all join in. When Moiraine realizes they don't know the meaning of the song, she tells them the story of the fall of Manetheren, which means mountain home, and stood where the Two Rivers now stands. In the Trolloc Wars, which began 1,000 years after the breaking, Manetheren stood strong against the forces of the Dark One, and a crushing host was sent to defeat them. They resisted for 10 days, despite the overwhelming odds and the promise of aid that never came. Finally, King Aemon was killed, and his wife Eldrine felt his death through their bond. She unleashed her grief by channeling more of the power than any woman could. She destroyed the Shadowspawn, the city, and herself. But the children and their minders survived to start over, and from this history, the people of the Two Rivers are descended. I'll have more to say on this in my spoiler discussion later in the video. As they find a place to rest for the night, Moiraine notices that Lan is skirting their path very close to Shadar Logoth, a place that she says is too dangerous to enter. Lan changes the subject to the White Cloaks, and Moiraine has not failed to notice the 7 Aes Sedai rings that Valdo now wears as a trophy. She will not forget his face either. While they've stopped, Egwene finally confronts Rand about giving her the silent treatment. Rand is angry that Egwene might want them to go back to the way things were, which he can't do. But Egwene cuts through his anger. With everything they are going through, she just wants him to look at her and not hate her. Rand says he could never hate her. I have to admit, Rand's way of responding to everything with anger is valid. Everyone responds differently to trauma, but it is a way that is more difficult for me to relate to, making him one of the most challenging characters for me in this episode. When Perrin is gathering water and checking his wound, a pack of wolves approach him. They are snarling and howling, and he feels threatened, but he remains still and closes his eyes. One of the wolves approaches him, only to lick his wound and then lead the pack off. By the fire at night, Moraine's breathing is hoarse, and Egwene is worried. Lan tells them all they need sleep just as much as she does. Egwene later startles awake as if she has sensed something, and she sees a Myrddraal looking down on them from above. They have been found. Lan wakes everyone, but Moiraine cannot move on her own. He puts her on Perrin's horse and tells him to ride east to Shadar Logoth. They are chased by the Shadowspawn to the walls of Shadar Logoth, where Bella stops. The Shadowspawn stop as well. Lan leads them in, saying the Trollocs won't follow them inside. Inside the fallen city's walls, Perrin comments on the absolute silence of not one living thing. Lan carries the barely breathing Moiraine into a temple. While checking Moraine's wound and keeping her warm, Lan has an actual monologue, explaining how Eredal, the richest city at the time of the Trolloc Wars, fell and became Shadar Logoth, which means shadows waiting. They closed their walls, promised aid to Manetheren that they never sent. And then, when refugees came there after the war, they found it completely empty, as if an evil had consumed every living thing inside of it. But it's not the evil of the Dark One, because Shadowspawn are afraid to enter there as well. I just lost it when Matt started his response with a couple of things, pointing out that Lan has not said so many words together ever, and why in the light did he bring them there? Lan just responds with, touch nothing and eat only the food you brought with you. Despite this, Rand immediately walks out of the temple. He finds a vantage point where he can look out over the city. It still has a beauty, even in its eeriness. Egwene has followed him, and Rand silently takes her hand as they look out together. Another of my favorite scenes in this episode comes next, where Matt goes to Perrin inside the temple, sits down next to him, and talks to him about the knife he carries, which Layla made for him. Layla said it was a tool, not a weapon, but to keep it sharp in case Matt ever did need it. He gives the knife to Perrin, calling it a tool still, to save his own life or that of someone he loves. Perrin has tears in his eyes as he looks at the knife, and Matt says Layla seemed to think if Matt ever needed it, it would be to protect Perrin, who would only get in trouble if Matt got him there. He then has one of his other truly great line deliveries in this episode. To be perfectly honest, I don't see how anyone could reasonably blame me for any of this. And Perrin actually smiles and thanks Matt. Perrin then returns the comfort. He tells Matt his sisters will be fine, that Perrin's parents, as well as Egwene's and Tam, will be over checking on them. Matt says he knows. As evening falls, things are getting creepier. We hear some whistling, some whispered voices, and then the horses are neighing as Matt startles awake and goes outside to see what is happening. He wanders a bit and finds his eyes falling on an ornate box partially hidden by debris. He opens it and takes out a dagger with a gold hilt and sheath and an embedded ruby in the hilt. At this moment, the horses become more agitated. Rand goes back to see and finds that Rand, Perrin, and Egwene are also merging to see what is happening. One of the horses is consumed by a shadow and turns to dust. We now can surmise that similar piles of dust throughout the city are other people or animals who have been consumed. The other horses run, except Lan's Mandarb and Moiraine's Aldib. Presumably their horses are trained in a way the Two Rivers ones are not. I do have to say, I'm very upset that Bella disappeared, and I certainly hope we see her again. Moiraine wakes and realizes where they are, telling Lan, "You've killed us all." Outside, shadows creep over walls and statues in the ground, dividing Perrin and Egwene on one side and Mat and Rand on the other. Both pairs must flee in different directions. Egwene telling Rand she will find him. Mat has to pull Rand away. Perrin and Egwene are pursued by shadows atop the walls and must jump into the river. Rand and Mat have to force their way through gates to get beyond the wall. Rand doesn't want to cross the river, leaving the others behind, but Mat insists. Lan has carried Moiraine on his horse and leading hers beyond the wall. As he lays her down in the woods and is giving her water, he is off his guard. Someone has managed to sneak up on him and put a knife to his throat. The episode ends as he turns to Nynaeve, threatening to kill him if he does not take her to her friends. So I have to say, I loved this episode. The pacing was much better. We got so many wonderful little scenes. There was just a little bit more time and space for the characters to breathe, and we got to know them a little bit better as they're interacting with each other. There is a bit more humor, which I always find very welcome in The Wheel of Time, or in any serious story, to be honest. It was a really great cliffhanger. I did miss seeing Nynaeve in this episode, but it was probably worth it just for that shock appearance for new audience. I found the Lord of the Rings vibes very strong in this episode, with the ferry scene, the songs and stories while riding, and at the end, a ranger caught off his guard. But it's important to know that in the first book, The Eye of the World, Robert Jordan very deliberately included homages to Tolkien, before then broadening and expanding to create a very different kind of world and a different kind of storytelling. So it's not an accident. My one argument with this episode is the way that Lan is kind of thrown under the bus when it comes to the whole Shadar Logoth debacle. He apparently doesn't know as much as Moiraine does, or else he would have warned everyone to stay inside after dark, and for that matter, he would have brought the horses inside as well. So he doesn't come off looking great, and Moiraine is very quick to blame him as well. To be fair to Lan, he was pretty much out of options. But he also puts his focus so completely on Moiraine that he pretty much leaves everyone else to their own devices. As for Mat, he does do one of the two things that Lan told him not to do, which is touch something. But I did not find it nearly as maddening as I did in the book. More on that in a bit. Now it's time for some deep dive spoiler discussion. I will be talking about The Eye of the World in the first part of The Great Hunt, so you've been warned, the rest of the video will spoil those. But I hope you will come back for my next breakdown. I have to say I'm really impressed with the changes to the White Cloaks so far. They are much more frightening than they were in the books at this point. It was a great choice to bring Eamon Valda in sooner because he is one of the worst White Cloaks, and he makes a great contrast to Bornhald, who was always one of the few with some reason left. I was surprised that Bornhald went so far as to suggest that Moiraine get healing from an Aes Sedai. I did not think that that is something that he would say. But this line does give us some information. It tells us how serious Moiraine's wound is, and again, it does create that contrast between him and Valda. So I do understand why the line is there. Valda being a questioner, I think also is useful in that it helps us understand those different factions a little bit, and it's fitting for his level of zealotry. There are some interesting and subtle character moments in that high tower scene. We have Moiraine having just this very small moment of what looks like regret, which she really only keeps to herself. She doesn't let anyone else see this. Then we have Rand and Lan glaring at each other. That hurts me a bit, even though it makes sense that Rand would be the one to offer Moiraine the most resistance, and Lan would not have any kind of patience for someone who is rude to Moiraine. But I do love the later friendship that they develop, so I am anxious to see that that is included in the show eventually. I feel that the characterization of the four Ta'veren is working really well so far, as are Lan and Moiraine. That's the thing that's most important to me, and I really feel that they are getting that right. There are a few subtle things that are making me wonder if Perrin might have had feelings for Egwene at some point. This is not something that I think was really hinted at much in the book, but there's a lot of very subtextual things, but it is adding up. Even back in the first episode, Perrin was sort of hanging around to see Egwene, even though his wife was back at the forge. And then in this episode, he sort of breaks out of his grief a little bit to offer some comfort to Egwene. He offers her his coat, and then he asks her if she thinks they will go home. Rand's dream really works for me. I really like how they're adapting the Baalzamon dreams so far. It's creepy, but it doesn't give away too much, and I don't think it would have worked to have the sort of long, ranty monologues that we sometimes got in the books. And then I love the way they adapted Moiraine's Weep for Manetheren speech. I was really hoping they would do something like this, because I don't think it would have really fit in that first episode. And here it gets a little bit more space to breathe. And the foreshadowing in it is really brilliant. If you haven't finished the whole book series, you're really going to want to skip ahead just a moment, because I do want to mention something that does spoil something that is endgame, end of A Memory of Light. So if you haven't finished the books, I'm going to keep this little spoiler banner up with the timestamps on it. Skip ahead. Okay. So in this story that Moiraine tells, she tells us about Eldreen's fate, Queen Eldreen's fate. And it's eerily similar to Egwene's fate. And as she is talking about this, the camera lingers on Egwene's face. So well done. Okay, I am done with A Memory of Light spoilers. In the Shadow Locust scenes, there are some nice little Easter eggs. We hear some whistling again, reminding us of Fane and suggesting that he is there as well. Now, we don't see Mordeth, but we get this little glimpse of movement here at one point, which suggests that maybe he is lurking around. It's a nice thing that, it might never really be explained or even need to be, but it's there for the book fans to notice. As for Matt, I was curious how I would react to him taking the dagger in this episode, because it was something that just really irked me in the books, and having less sympathy for him at that point. It was better. Yeah, I definitely was more understanding of what happens here. I don't find him nearly so reckless, even though there is recklessness to it, but it's not as unforgivable. Some of that burden of responsibility gets shifted to Lan, so I have to be a little bit annoyed at him. Overall, that was the one thing that I couldn't fully love about the changes in this episode, but otherwise I'm really happy with the changes in this episode, and it was less overall compared to the first episode. I can't wait to talk about episode 3. I loved it even more than this one, but I don't think I will have it to you before episode 4 drops. Life circumstances just have not been conspiring to make that possible, but I should be able to catch up by next week. I hope you're enjoying these breakdowns. Leave me a like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones if you do. And definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, keep those loins girded, my friends.